On a winter evening above the wildlife park, an elderly keeper stood by his back door, an envelope of Lynx transfer papers waiting on the table. Most nights, his sleek black house cat with bright golden eyes let him pass without protest. Tonight the cat slid from the chair, blocked the doorway, and stared toward the dark yard. When it bolted ahead, leapt to the old metal bucket and struck it once. His hand froze on the envelope, suddenly unsure. By the time the park closed, the paths turned the colour of cooling ash. Harold liked that hour, when the last stroller rattled away and the only sounds were the hum of the filters and the faint rush of the highway beyond the trees. He locked the front gate, pulled his collar up against the evening chill, and felt the familiar ache in his knees as he started his last round. The service yard sat behind the exhibits, a square of cracked concrete and stacked lumber. In the middle of it, near the hose spigot, stood the metal bucket with the wooden handle. Harold had been leaving it there for years, too stubborn to replace it. Tonight, as he crossed the yard, he heard something, a tiny tap, as if a spoon had nudged the rim. Then silence so complete, his breath sounded loud. He paused, listening. The air smelled of damp straw and the faint iron tang of cold metal. A light wind pushed through the pines above, making the security lamps sway and throw slow-moving shadows along the fence. Another tap came, lighter this time, followed by a soft scrape on concrete. Harold's skin prickled along his neck, probably just the handle settling, he told himself, or a stray pebble kicked by the wind. Still, his eyes drifted toward the bucket. The metal bucket with the wooden handle gleamed under the lamp, perfectly still. Nothing nearby moved. The only sound now was the distant filter pump and a low, steady breathing from the far enclosure. Harold shifted his flashlight in his hand. For some reason he could feel his own heartbeat in his ears, heavier than it ought to be for a quiet evening with no visitors left to manage. On his way to the back pen, his boot nudged something small and smooth. He bent down and picked up a dark chip of bark, polished on one side. He could have sworn it hadn't been there during the afternoon check. As he straightened, the security lamp flickered once, and a slim shadow slipped past the edge of the yard, just outside the cone of light. He turned quickly, joints complaining, but the shadow was gone. Only the smell of earth and old leaves drifted in from the tree line. "You're getting jumpy," he muttered. "Long days." That was all. The doctor had warned him about fatigue, about how the mind plays tricks when the body is tired. Still, when another faint clink rose behind him, he felt his shoulders tighten like a man bracing for bad news. Harold walked back to the centre of the yard. The metal bucket with the wooden handle sat exactly where Head left it. No marks, no dents, not even a leaf against its side. Yet he noticed the wet ring around its base was slightly smeared, as if something small had circled it. Careful but insistent. The air felt cooler here. A little bite against his cheeks, though the weather report had promised a mild evening. From the far pen came a low rustle, a heavier body turning over straw. Then, carried through the dusk like a question, there was another sound, soft steps on concrete, then a deliberate tap against metal. Harold's fingers tightened around his flashlight. The pattern had been the same 3 nights in a row now. Nearly the same minute. The same hollow ring. Someone was here, he thought, and for the first time, he couldn't quite tell whether that comforted him or not. Morning light made the service yard look harmless again. Frost clung to the edges of the concrete, outlining every crack in thin white lines. Harold stepped out from the maintenance shed with his thermos and rubbed his thumb over the lid until it squeaked. The metal bucket with the wooden handle caught the low sun, throwing a small, bright flare into his eyes. Nothing mysterious in daylight, he told himself. Just tools and chores. Yet even then, a sound reached him, a light thud followed by a quick, skittering scrape. He felt it first in his chest, that little skip of worry, before he turned. Near the bucket, a sleek, dark shape paused. One forepaw lifted. It touched the rim with a soft tap that rang faintly in the cold air. For a heartbeat, the shape's yellow eyes met his, bright and unblinking, and then the black cat vanished behind the stacked lumber. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Well, midnight, he murmured, feeling both foolish and oddly relieved. Of course it would be his own house cat making mischief. The park was full of crumbs, warm corners, and forgotten bowls. Still, the timing tugged at him. Evening taps, morning taps, always on that same old bucket. His shoulders loosened, but a different curiosity took hold, settling behind his ribs like a folded note. He walked over and leaned down. The metal bucket with the wooden handle showed faint smudges along one side, just above the wet ring. Tiny streaks of dust, as if midnight had stood up and balanced there. He brushed a fingertip along the marks and felt a strange warmth in his chest, almost like the feeling he used to get when his wife squeezed his arm and didn't say anything at all. From the far enclosure came a soft chuffing sound, followed by the creak of straw as a larger body shifted its weight. Harold turned toward the mesh. Inside, only shadows moved, long and slow across the logs. The lynx that lived there rarely showed itself when the park was quiet. It preferred corners, thickets of branches, the farthest distance it could find from human voices. Even so, he felt watched, as if 2 different pairs of eyes weighed his every step. He set his thermos down on the concrete and listened. A faint rustle brushed the back of his mind, like a memory's soft pause crossing the yard. A breathy huff from the enclosure. The tiny clink of claw on metal. His skin prickled under his jacket. It's just habit, he told himself. You know how animals get. Yet another thought slid in beneath that one, quieter and harder to dismiss. Habits form for a reason. Later that afternoon, when the last school group had left and the echo of their chatter faded, he saw Midnight again. The black cat slipped along the edge of the walkway, hugging the low wall, and then sat neatly beside the metal bucket with the wooden handle. One paw rose, rested on the rim, and gave it a gentle pat. From the far pen came a low, answering rumble, the kind of sound that vibrated more in the bones than in the ear. Harold stood very still, his breath caught halfway. Midnight flicked an ear toward the enclosure, waited, then tapped the rim again, slower this time, almost thoughtful. Straw rustled. A heavier outline moved closer to the mesh, stopping just inside the shade. The pattern was unmistakable now. Tap. Answer. Hush. Harold felt his heart knock once, twice, against his ribs. Why here? He whispered. Why now? And why me in the middle of it? That night, sleep came in fit. Every time Harold drifted off, he heard the thin ring of metal and saw Midnight poised by the bucket, eyes bright against the grey yard. By dawn he gave up, made coffee too strong, and sat at his small kitchen table, staring at the steam. Had worked with animals for 40 years. Had seen patterns in behaviour, routines shaped by food and fear. But something about this felt older, as if it belonged to a life head almost forgotten. His mind wandered back to another property from long ago, a farm he and his wife had once rented on the edge of town. Back then, there had been a leaning shed and a different metal pail they used for evening chores. Wanderers from the fields would drift through the tall grass, drawn by the rattling grain. He remembered how she would tap that pail with a wooden spoon at dusk and watch the shy barn cats emerge from the weeds. Cautious, yet hopeful. When illness took her, he had left that life behind. He sold what little they owned, gave up the farm job, and took the keeper position at the wildlife park because the animals there belonged to the county, not to him. It seemed safer that way. You couldn't lose what you never fully claimed. He kept his days busy with routine. Feed, clean, repair, walk the perimeter, log the notes. Feelings stayed folded in a drawer he rarely opened. The first time he saw Midnight had been during a cold snap 3 winters before, when snow hardened into squeaky crust. Harold had noticed tiny prints under the staff entrance, 4 neat toes with rounded pads, tracking a wandering loop between dumpsters and the maintenance shed. One evening, a dark tail disappeared under his porch just as freezing rain began to tap the windows. He left out a dish of warm water and a few crumbs, telling himself it was only for the night. The crumbs kept disappearing. On the 4th evening, he looked down to find a black cat curled against his radiator, breathing slow, as if it had always belonged there. Midnight's history was sketched on its coat patches where fur had grown back unevenly, the faint stiffness in one hind leg, the way it flinched when boots came too close. Whatever roads it had walked, they had not all been kind, but it had chosen his small apartment as a harbour. He hadn't planned to keep the cat. He told himself he was just offering shelter until the weather broke, that he would ask around town and see if anyone missed a dark shadow with bright eyes. But no one did. Flyers in the laundromat went unanswered. Days turned into weeks, and midnight learned the rhythm of the park. The morning clatter of feed carts, the mid-afternoon murmur of families, the quiet slide of keys in locks after closing. Outside, in a different pen, another newcomer had arrived around the same time. The Lynx had been found in the logging country to the north, half-starved and limping, caught in a tangle of downed branches near an access road. No one knew exactly what had happened, only that it had taken a tranquilizer dart and 3 strong men to bring the snarling, terrified bundle into the transport crate. Its file listed it as temporary rehabilitation, but months had stretched on without a firm plan. From the beginning, the Lynx distrusted everyone. The first weeks were full of low growls and eyes that burned from the corners of the den. It refused food if anyone lingered. It struck at tools that came too close through the mesh. Even when the wounds healed and the limp eased, the fear did not. Visitors rarely saw more than a flick of tufted ears or a quick flash of spotted fur before it vanished back into its shelter. Harold understood that kind of wariness. After his wife's passing, Head felt much the same when neighbours tried to draw him into conversations that went beyond weather and chores. He watched the lynx pace along the back wall of its enclosure, circling the same path over and over, leaving a faint groove in the dirt. On winter evenings, Head sometimes stand outside the mesh and talk in a low voice, mostly to fill the space between them with something softer than silence. It was during one of those talks, months later, that he realized midnight had followed him down to the service yard. The black cat lingered near the concrete, eyes turned toward the far pen, tail curled neatly around its paws. The lynx kept its distance, but its gaze never left the smaller animal. In that triangle of attention, man, house cat, hidden predator Harold felt an invisible thread begin to form, thin but real, pulled tight by shared history with cold and hunger and loss. The first true turning point arrived on a grey afternoon when clouds hung low enough to scrape the treetops. The park was nearly empty, Just a couple of regulars in thick coats drifting past the wolf exhibit. Harold tightened his scarf and stepped into the service yard with the familiar creak in his knees. There, beside the metal bucket with the wooden handle, Midnight sat waiting as if it had been expecting him all along. The black cat's body faced the far enclosure, its ears angled toward the mesh. For a moment, it didn't seem to notice Harold at all. Instead, it lifted one forepaw and placed it carefully on the rim of the metal bucket with the wooden handle. The gesture was unhurried, almost ceremonial. Then came that now familiar tap, a gentle, resonant note that floated out across the yard and settled into the quiet like a dropped pebble into still water. From deep within the enclosure, straw rustled. A thick furred shape emerged from the shadows, moving with wary grace. Tufted ears pricked forward, nose testing the air. The patterning on the lynx's coat caught the dim light and broke it into subtle bands. It stopped halfway between shelter and fence, staring at Midnight by the bucket. Harold held his breath, afraid that the slightest motion might snap the fragile scene in two. Midnight tapped the rim again. This time the sound was a hair louder, more insistent. The lynx's whiskers twitched. It lowered its head, eyes sharp, and made a low, questioning rumble. Harold felt the sound through the soles of his boots. His chest tightened with something like awe. One small house cat from his radiator, one rescued ghost from the logging roads, and a battered old man, all balanced on the thin music of a battered piece of equipment. Slowly, Harold eased closer, careful not to let his keys jingle. A lifetime of experience told him to keep his distance, to avoid startling either animal. Yet a quieter instinct urged him forward. He knelt beside the metal bucket with the wooden handle, joints protesting, and rested his rough hand near the rim without touching it. Midnight flicked him a glance. Then, as if in agreement, tapped the bucket once more. The reaction in the enclosure was immediate. The lynx stepped closer to the mesh than Harold had ever seen it venture. Its paws made no sound on the packed earth. It stopped just short of the fence, chest rising and falling a little too fast, pupils wide. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Harold's skin tingled where the cold air met his exposed wrist. He could hear his own heartbeat ticking between the soft breaths on both sides of the barrier. Then the lynx extended its nose toward the fence and released a slow exhale, breath misting through the wire. Midnight answered by leaning forward, body relaxed but intent, eyes half-lidded. Harold saw no fear there, only focus and some quieter recognition he couldn't name. Without thinking, he gave the bucket a gentle tap of his own, echoing the rhythm head heard over the past week. The lynx blinked, then made a sound that was almost a hum, deep in its chest. It stepped sideways along the fence, following the bucket as Harold shifted it a few inches. Its gaze stayed locked on the rim, as if that battered circle of metal held the map to a safer world. For the first time, Harold sensed not just wariness, but willingness, a fragile thread of trust being pulled, not toward him directly, but toward the ritual he now shared with Midnight. As the afternoon wore on, the scene repeated. Midnight would sit beside the metal bucket with the wooden handle, tap it once or twice, then glance toward the enclosure. The Lynx would draw near, step back, approach again, each time a fraction closer, each time lingering a little longer. By closing time, Harold's knees ached from crouching, but his chest felt strangely light, as if someone had quietly opened a window inside him. Walking back to his apartment, he realized his curiosity had settled into something deeper. This was not random. The tapping had rhythm. The responses a pattern. His little house cat was doing more than playing with reflections and noise. Midnight was calling out to cross a divide, inviting a hidden heart closer, one hollow note at a time. And somewhere along the way, without asking his permission, it had drawn Harold into that invitation too. The first storm warnings came as a crawl across the bottom of the old television in Harold's kitchen. Freezing rain, falling temperatures, wind gusts strong enough to bring down branches. The park director debated closing for the day, but weekend revenue was hard to give up. By noon, clouds lobbed pellets of ice against the exhibit glass. Visitors hurried between shelters, shoulders hunched. Harold felt a familiar heaviness settle in his chest, the sense that something fragile was about to be tested. He did an extra round of checks, eyes on posts and mesh and the aging trees leaning over the back fence. The Lynx's enclosure worried him most. It backed onto a shallow drainage gully that had a habit of turning into a narrow river when storms stalled. The ground out there was already slick. Inside, the Lynx paced its groove along the wall, every muscle tight, ears flicking at each new gust that rattled the metal signs. In the service yard, the wind made the metal bucket with the wooden handle rattle softly where it touched the concrete. Midnight trotted at his heels. Fur puffed against the cold. Tail held low but steady. When a sharp gust tossed grit across the yard, the black cat flinched, then moved straight to the bucket and set a paw on its rim, as if anchoring it. The small, deliberate tap that followed rang clearer than the storm's distant growl. By late afternoon, the director pulled him aside in the office. The city facility had finally called back. They could take the Lynx within the month, maybe sooner if weather cooperated. Bigger enclosure, more staff, indoor space, she said, pointing to the email. It's what's best for him. Harry, And for you, too, you're past retirement age. No shame in letting this one go. Her words were kind, but they scraped against a place Head kept carefully numb. That night, as freezing rain thickened into a sheet, Harold sat at his kitchen table with the lights low, listening to ice tick against the window. Midnight lay in a tight curl on the chair opposite, eyes slitted but awake. The idea of the Lynx being loaded into another crate, jolted towards some new city, made his stomach knot. He reminded himself that he had promised, after his wife, to never grip anything living too hard. Still, the thought of that enclosure standing empty hollowed him out. A sudden clatter from below pulled him to his feet. It sounded like metal skidding on concrete, followed by the heavy thump of something large hitting the fence. Harold grabbed his jacket and flashlight. Midnight was already at the door, fur on end, tail fluffed like a bottle brush. Together they hurried down the back stairs into the storm, where icy pellets stung his face and turned the yard into a slick, glittering mess. The security lamp swung wildly, throwing jagged light across the service yard. The metal bucket with the wooden handle lay on its side, rolling in a slow circle as wind shoved it. Midnight dashed to it and planted both front paws on the rim, stopping its spin. Beyond the yard, a louder crash sounded wood against metal. Then the sharp, frightened yowl he knew too well. The Lynx's enclosure. His knees nearly buckled with the surge of dread. He ran, boots sliding on the freezing surface, one hand skimming the fence for balance. At the back corner of the Lynx's pen, a heavy branch had come down, its thick end wedged against the mesh. The wire bulged inward, straining against the supports. Inside, the Lynx darted back and forth, eyes blown wide, tail lashing. One good shift, Harold thought, and the mesh might tear or the supports might give. Either outcome ended badly for the animal, or for anyone nearby. Wind hurled sleet into his face as he threw his weight against the branch, trying to shove it free. It barely budged. His breath came in white bursts. Pain flared down his lower back and left leg. He imagined the director's voice in his head, telling him this was proof the work had grown too heavy. Another crack sounded overhead, a warning that more might come down. For a heartbeat, he almost turned back, almost chose safety and acceptance over one more struggle. Then he felt a small body brushing against his ankle. Midnight threaded between his feet, then sprinted back toward the service yard, looking over its shoulder as if to be sure he watched. The black cat leaped onto the concrete beside the metal bucket with the wooden handle, set its paws on the rim, and began to tap rhythmic, insistent, the hollow ring rising above the wind. From the enclosure came a sudden stillness, as though every nerve inside had turned toward that sound. Harold understood the message, though no one had spoken it. The lynx needed a clear path, a place to move that felt less like a trap and more like a choice. The park had a small shifting stool connected to the main pen by a sliding gate, a space they rarely used because the lynx hated confinement. To guide it there in this storm would mean trusting the fragile ritual that had been building for months and trusting his own aging body to hold up long enough to make it work. He forced himself back to the gate controls, fingers numbed by cold and fear. The handle for the shifting stool was stiff. Ice had started to crust along the metal. With a grunt that sent pain lancing through his shoulder, he pried it loose and eased the gate open a few inches. Inside the enclosure, the lynx froze mid-pace, eyes fixing on the widening gap, then flicking back toward the service yard where the tapping continued like a steady heartbeat. Midnight did not stop. The black cat balanced on the rim of the metal bucket with the wooden handle, small muscles working beneath its sleek coat, tail curled for balance. Tap. Pause. Tap, tap. Each note floated through the storm, strangely clear. Harold, chest heaving, dragged the bucket a little closer to the mesh, careful not to spook either animal. The lynx's ears flicked forward. It took a single step toward them, then another, claws making tiny crunches in the frozen mud. For a moment, all three of them stood in a crooked line. Old man braced against the fence. House cat poised on dented metal. Wild heart quivering on the other side. Harold's mind flashed back to his wife on the farm, tapping her grain pail as twilight pooled in the fields. Shy shapes had crept out then, drawn not just by food, but by a voice and a rhythm that promised they were seen. He had thought that ritual faded forever when the rental sign went up and the house emptied. Now he heard her pattern in midnight's pause, felt her memory in the hollow ring. This wasn't random mischief. The little cat had been calling across distances he hadn't wanted to cross, calling the lynx closer, calling Harold out of the safe numbness head wrapped around himself. The realization made his throat ache. He blinked sleep from his eyelashes and, with a care that felt like prayer, lifted his own hand to the rim. When Harold tapped the metal bucket with the wooden handle, his touch fell into the same gentle rhythm midnight had set. Tap, 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 pause. The lynx's sides heaved, breath visible in the cold, but its paws kept moving toward the open gate. One more step, and it was close enough that he could see each whisker bead with ice. Its eyes met his, not wild now, but searching, as if weighing whether this worn figure outside the fence could be trusted one more time. The storm roared at their backs, wind shoving them toward a choice. Harold could slam the gate, call in the emergency team, and let someone younger wrestle the animal into a crate for an early transfer, or he could lean into this fragile bridge of sound and memory, risking that the lynx might bolt or turn on itself in panic. The thought of losing it to a distant institution, after all these months of careful distance, made something deep in him finally say no. Easy. Friend, he breathed, voice trembling. It's your call. He tapped the bucket again, softer now, letting the rhythm speak more than his words could. Midnight leaned forward, eyes never leaving the lynx, tail tip flicking with quiet urgency. The wild cat's gaze slipped once more from man to metal to little black figure, then back. Then, with the smallest of nods that felt like a bow, it turned and stepped through the sliding gate into the shifting stool. An old keeper saw his house cat tap the metal bucket the waiting lynx chose him that day. Not with a handshake or a signature, but with that single, deliberate step. Harold's chest loosened as if a tight band had snapped. He swung the gate slowly shut, securing the latch with shaking hands. Inside the stool, the lynx paced once in a tight circle, then settled against the far wall, eyes still on him, no longer burning with panic, but with wary acknowledgement. Midnight dropped lightly to the ground and walked along the fence until it reached the stool wall. The lynx pressed its nose toward the seam. The black cat touched the metal there with one paw, claws sheathed. For a long moment, the three of them stood in the sleet and humming wind, a makeshift trio held together by an old farm woman's long-ago rhythm and a battered bucket that had somehow become an altar of trust. Later, when the emergency crew arrived to reinforce the fence and check the stool, Harold downplayed his role. He made sure they saw the structural risk, the need to keep the lynx secure until the storm passed. But inside, something had shifted. The decision about transfer no longer felt like paperwork being done to them. It felt like a question awaiting his answer. The lynx had chosen to trust the sound that led through him. Now he had to decide what to do with that choice. That night, after hot showers and stiff tea, he sat on the couch with Midnight in his lap and the television muttering in the background. His hands still shook faintly from the cold and the adrenaline. When the director called to say the city truck had postponed its visit due to the storm damage, he surprised himself by asking if they could reconsider the move altogether, or at least involve him in the decision. I think he's finally starting to choose this place, Harold said, and he'd like the chance to keep choosing him. The weeks that followed shook loose the last of the ice and left the park washed in pale, clean light. Branches were cleared, fences mended, and the drainage gully reshaped into a safer slope. The transfer papers stayed in a folder on the director's desk, unsigned. Well, revisit it later, she told him, but there was a softness in her eyes now when she watched the lynx watch Harold. Something had changed in the air, and not only in the animal pens. A new rhythm settled over Harold's days. Each morning before the gates opened, he and Midnight made their slow circuit from the office to the service yard. The black cat trotted ahead, tail held like a small flag, stopping only when it reached the metal bucket with the wooden handle. There, it would wait until he caught up, then set a paw on the rim and tap once, a modest little chime that seemed to say, "Ready." More often than not, a shadow stirred in the Lynx enclosure at the sound. Visitors began to notice. Retirees who walked the park for exercise would pause by the enclosure, watching the spotted figure that now lingered near the front logs instead of vanishing at the first footstep. Children pointed out the black house cat that worked here, following the old keeper from chore to chore. Harold pretended to grumble about distraction from the feeding schedule, but secretly he warmed to the way strangers' faces softened when they recognized the small partnership at work. On slow afternoons, he would sit on an overturned crate in the service yard, sipping lukewarm coffee while Midnight dozed atop the metal bucket with the wooden handle, body draped in a relaxed curve. The Lynx lay on its favourite log inside the pen, eyes half shut, chin resting on crossed paws, watching them through the mesh. Wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth. The filter pumps hummed their low, steady song. For the first time in years, Harold felt less like a guard and more like a neighbour. He found himself talking again in ways he hadn't since his wife telling the Lynx about the weather, about the price of bread at the market, about the ache in his hip that flared when the pressure changed. Midnight would flick its ears as if taking notes. The Lynx listened with that still, intent gaze that made words seem heavier and more worthwhile. Some evenings he would catch his reflection in the exhibit glass, surprised at how much less alone it looked, with two smaller shapes bracketing it. Season turned quietly. Buds popped along the maple branches lining the entrance. The storm damage became just another story to share with new volunteers. The night a branch nearly broke the fence. The night the shy Lynx walked into the shifting stool by choice. Each time he told it, Harold's hand drifted unconsciously toward the bucket handle, thumb rubbing the worn groove where Midnight's claws had so often rested. The ritual had become a part of him. One evening, as the sun slid behind the trees and painted the yard in long gold stripes, he watched Midnight hop lightly onto the metal bucket with the wooden handle and give it a single, soft tap. The Lynx, already lounging near the fence, responded with a slow blink and a low, contented rumble. Harold stood between them, a little off-centre, feeling the quiet weight of their attention settle on his shoulders like a shore. For once, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like being held. Years eased forward, not in grand leaps, but in the small ways he felt every morning. A little more stiffness in his hands. A little more breath needed to climb the office stairs. Eventually, Harold signed the retirement papers himself, not because anyone forced him, but because Head begun to trust that leaving the payroll didn't mean leaving the lives Head woven himself into. The park threw him a modest farewell with supermarket cake and a framed photo of him near the Lynx enclosure. He didn't go far. His apartment above the office stayed his, at reduced rent, in exchange for a few volunteer hours a week. He still made the early rounds. Keys now carried more out of habit than authority. Midnight, older but no less sure-footed, led the way each morning. The Lynx, broader in the chest and silvering around the muzzle, greeted them with a quiet chuff, rising from its log as they approached. Their triangle had shifted shape but not distance. The metal bucket with the wooden handle no longer needed to stand in the middle of the service yard. Harold moved it to a spot just inside the back door, where the overhang kept off rain and snow. Its rim was dented from years of small paws and old hands, but he polished it now and then, the way some people polish family silver. Visitors rarely noticed it, yet the animals did. Midnight still hopped up to tap it, and the Lynx still lifted its head at the sound. Sometimes, on calm afternoons, he would sit on the bench facing the enclosure and tell the story to new staff or curious regulars. How a storm had shaken the park. How a frightened wild heart had made a choice. How a little black cat had carried an old farm rhythm into a different life. He didn't embellish much. The truth already felt like something out of a fable. As he spoke, Midnight would curl at his side and the Lynx would lounge in the shade. Living proof that trust could stretch across wire and weather and years. On his last official day in uniform, when he turned in his badge and folded his work jacket over his arm, Harold paused by the back door. Midnight sat beside the metal bucket with the wooden handle, tail wrapped neatly around its paws. The Lynx watched from its favourite log, eyes soft, ears relaxed. He reached down, tapped the rim once more, and listened to the answering rumble from the pen. The sound wrapped the little yard in a quiet warmth. "I'm glad we found each other in this life," he said, and knew it was true for all three of them. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.